Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 21, November 1932 to March 1933.
Upon the Japanese government and nation, the tidings of this great naval disaster fell as a veritable thunderclap. The leaders of the opposition now demanded the resignation of the cabinet on the score of incompetence. The naval members of the War Council bitterly reproached their military confreres with having deliberately thrown away all chance of victory in defiance of the advice of those who had pointed out the danger, while the public, on the full implication of the defeat being explained to them in the newspapers, clamored for the heads of those who had brought the country's affairs to such an evil pass. Other misfortunes came thick and fast. On the outbreak of war with China, Japan had endeavored to maintain her ascendancy by the occupation of certain points of strategical importance, but these garrisons were gradually isolated by General Wang Tsu's forces and compelled to surrender or withdraw. Nor was this the end. Having freed China proper from the domination of the hated foreigner, the Celestial Government directed its energies to Inner Mongolia, from which territory Japanese interests also found themselves excluded. Following upon this, General Wang Tsu in person led his armies across the Manchurian frontier at Chinwangtao during the last days of October. On finding his sway challenged, Li Pinghui, already uneasy, flew to arms, but again he proved himself no match for the redoubtable Wang. Though he brought his best troops into the field, regardless of a renewed insurrection which promptly burst into flame in northern Manchuria, they only served to make his fall more striking. In a pitched battle north of Newchwang, Li's soldiers were crushingly defeated, and those who did not seek safety in flight eagerly proffered their allegiance to the new power. Li himself, who had imprudently endeavored to rally his flying forces, found himself made prisoner by his own men and led before Wang as a hostage. The Chinese government, on the advice of their general, who could afford to be magnanimous, contented themselves with exiling Li to a distant province, where he might meditate on the futility of human ambition. To make matters worse, a division of Japanese troops, which had been hurrying to the support of their ally, arrived too late to save the situation, and found itself in a hostile country, enveloped on all sides by superior Chinese forces, estimated at nearly 200,000 bayonets. After a gallant attempt to cut its way through to the coast, this force was swamped by sheer weight of numbers, and the remnant surrendered after exhausting its ammunition. Wang Tsu, quick as ever to follow up an advantage, moved with the bulk of his forces along the railroad into the Kwangtung Peninsula, bent on investing the Japanese base at Ryojin, Port Arthur, before reinforcements could be thrown in. Daren, the commercial port which the Chinese call Talienwan and the Russians Dalny, could offer no effective resistance and became the headquarters of the Chinese army and siege train. For the Japanese government to assemble sufficient strength to relieve Ryojun was impossible without stripping Korea of its army of occupation, a step which in the unsettled state of that country was clearly out of the question. In view of the increasing unrest in Japan itself, which had already led to some ugly rioting in the industrial centers, the government hesitated to dispatch a relief expedition from home, more especially since, with the command of the sea wrested from them, the naval staff refused to take any responsibility for the safety of transports on the short voyage from Sasebo to the Yellow Sea. Feeling itself tottering, the cabinet over which Prince Kawamura still presided seems to have determined on a policy of inaction. The depleted Japanese battle fleet, under Admiral Hiraga, after executing temporary repairs at Cavite, had been withdrawn to Yokosuka, where it remained completely idle for the rest of the war. To guard the Philippines, a few small cruisers and other light forces remained in the vicinity of Manila, but Rear Admiral Uehara, the flag officer in command, was given strict orders to remain on the defensive, an attitude which does not encourage enterprise, and which on this occasion did nothing to hinder further loss of territory. Although for some weeks the Japanese Army of the Philippines, amounting to about 100,000 men, 75% of whom were in the island of Luzon, was left unmolested except by blockade, this was only because the first concern of the Americans was to reduce Guam. The defenders of that base, with their battle fleet swept from the board, can have entertained no hope of relief. But like true Japanese, they put up a strenuous fight. Their resistance was gradually worn down by the American tactics, which combined a steady long-range bombardment with frequent gas bomb attacks from the air. And on December 8th, the Stars and Stripes again floated over the island. No American naval units sustained any important damage during this operation. Manila Bay being closely blockaded by a squadron comprising a dozen cruisers and 6 divisions of destroyers, the problem of landing troops for the reconquest of the Philippines had to be faced. Taking a leaf from their opponent's book in the operations of March 1931, the American High Command sought to mislead the enemy. This was rendered easier by the superiority of the American Air Force, which subsequent to the attempted raid on Truk from Mindanao had gained a complete ascendancy over the Japanese airplanes. Repeated feints were made at disembarkation, all on the east coast of Luzon, with the result that large Japanese forces were concentrated in the neighborhood of Albay and around Dilasek Bay. This had an important influence on the result of the real landing, which was made near Lauag in the northwest of the island on December 28th. The casualties were heavy, as a Japanese battalion which was rushed to the spot fought almost to the last man in its endeavors to prevent the Americans gaining a footing. But its sacrifice proved vain. For, by the time Japanese reinforcements reached Lauag, the invaders had established too strong a hold to be driven out. More and more transports discharged their soldiers and munitions under cover of gunfire from the warships, until the offensive could be taken, and an advance made to the southward, the right flank of the American army being protected by cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese continued to fight a stubborn rearguard action during the next 48 hours, until they reached a strong line of carefully prepared entrenchments south of Lingayen, behind which the main Japanese army, nearly 50,000 strong, seems to have been massed. But in the meantime, a second landing had been effected near Dilasek Bay, which the Japanese had neglected to observe so closely since the real menace had materialized at Lauag. The Second Army of Invasion made a forced march across the island, brushing aside every obstacle which its surprised opponents sought to interpose, and arrived in the vicinity of Lingayen in time to take part in the battle which now developed. The Japanese commander-in-chief, General Kimura, finding this new enemy threatening to outflank him, swung round his right in an attempt to preserve his position, his plan apparently being to hold up one U.S. Army with a comparatively weak detachment while he concentrated in superior numbers on the other invader. But the efficient American air scouts were quick to detect this maneuver, and General Kimura soon found himself committed to a fierce battle on both fronts, with no prospect of reinforcement should the tide turn against him. In numbers, the combatants differed but slightly, but the American forces derived great assistance from their bombing airplanes, whereas every machine the Japanese sent up was instantly overwhelmed by a superior concentration. Such a conflict could have but one end. Kimura himself managed to secure his retreat to Manila with some 15,000 men, but the bulk of his army was surrounded and forced to capitulate, though not until nearly half its fighting strength was hors de combat. The American casualties were also severe, exceeding 11,000, and would have been much heavier but for the assistance rendered by the air squadrons, the gas bombs from which proved particularly effective. It was, in fact, the most desperately fought land engagement of the whole war, and both nations have reason to feel proud of their share in it. Officially known as the Battle of Lingayen, a monument is now being erected at a spot some distance to the south of that town, to mark where the carnage was heaviest. The funds for this cenotaph have been jointly contributed by American and Japanese members of a society which has been formed for the promotion of a better understanding between the two countries. On the night following the battle, the Japanese cruisers and destroyers in Manila Bay made an attempt to break through the American cordon of blockade. The Abukuma, Yubari, and at least 3 destroyers made good their escape. The others were driven back, 2 destroyers being sunk in a sharp action during which the USS Kansas City was torpedoed and had to be abandoned. A few days later, the remaining vessels were destroyed, by order of Rear Admiral Uyehara, with methodical thoroughness, it being apparent that Manila could not long hold out against the superior forces that were being concentrated against it. The very complete way in which these warships were rendered unfit for further service affords an interesting comparison with the ineffective scuttling of the Russian fleet at Port Arthur before the surrender in 1905. Manila capitulated on January 8, 1933. General Kimura and his garrison were allowed to return to Japan on their parole not to take any further part in the war. This arrangement has been harshly criticized in some quarters, but it should be widely known by now that General Clay, who was in chief command of the American military forces in Luzon, had private orders to avoid useless bloodshed in view of the anticipated early cessation of hostilities. Moreover, the news of the Manila garrison's surrender on these lenient terms undoubtedly hastened the reduction of isolated Japanese detachments in other parts of the group, since the majority of the soldiers were heartily sick of the struggle and only too anxious to get back to their homes. By this time it was evident to all that the war was approaching its end. China, the country for whose control Japan had risked so much, was now a completely independent power, and Korea showed every promise of following this example if outside aid were forthcoming. Sakhalin had been surrendered in its entirety to Russia in order to avoid bringing a fresh adversary into the field, and a new cabinet of pronounced democratic tendencies had replaced that of Prince Kawamura in Tokyo. Since the defeat of the Japanese fleet at Yap had given American cruisers a free hand to prey upon enemy commerce, the shortage of commodities had now become more marked, and this circumstance, coinciding with an acute financial crisis, was reducing the island empire to desperate straits. Credit must be given to the officer commanding the U.S. Flying Squadron, Rear Admiral Simmons, for an adroit move which, made as it was just at the psychological moment, is known to have had a decisive moral effect. The Flying Squadron, consisting of the airplane carriers Alaska, Curtis, Lexington, Saratoga, and Montauk, formed part of the U.S. fleet which was cruising off the Pacific coast of Japan during the last week of January 1933, with the object of enticing the enemy out of Yokosuka. On the night of January 30th, 50 airplanes were sent to make a demonstration flight above Tokyo, upon which city a number of bombs were dropped. These missiles were coated with luminous paint, and although attached to parachutes which arrested the violence of their descent, they created a panic in the thronged streets of the capital. But when it was seen that none of the bombs exploded, curiosity soon overcame alarm, and the strange projectiles were carefully examined. It was then discovered that each contained a bundle of leaflets, printed in Japanese, explaining that rather than waste more lives in a futile quarrel, the American nation preferred to appeal to the good sense of the Japanese people, with whom they had no real grounds for dissension. Attention was drawn to the fact that China, the nominal cause of the war, was now managing her own affairs without external assistance. Stress was also laid on the argument that two nations living on opposite sides of the greatest ocean in the world would be far better employed in peaceful trading than in reciprocal homicide. Though many of these bombs were confiscated by the police, thousands of the leaflets fell into the hands of the people. Broadcast in this novel way, such propaganda could not fail to make a strong appeal to the war-weary Japanese masses, whose demand for peace became so insistent that the government was forthwith constrained to sue for an armistice. This request was acceded to by the United States on February 4th, a complete truce being observed by both belligerents until the Treaty of Peace was signed at Shanghai on May 15, 1933. The terms of this covenant are too well known to call for repetition at any length. Briefly, they included the surrender by Japan of her mandate over the ex-German Pacific Islands north of the equator, and the assumption by the United States of responsibility for their future administration. Both countries formally undertook to abstain from any endeavors to exercise political or economic control over China or her contiguous territories, and both agreed to consult together with a view to joint action against any third power that might seek to acquire such control in the future. Territory which had changed hands during the war was to remain in status quo. This clause applied in reality only to the United States, which had forcibly recovered all her original possessions in the Western Pacific, besides having seized the Caroline, Pelew, Mariana, and Marshall Islands. But its insertion proved a salve to Japan's dignity. While no indemnity was demanded by the United States, a separate protocol embodied provisions for commercial reciprocity, which have already yielded beneficial results to both the signatory powers. Now that peace has been re-established on a sound and apparently permanent basis, the historian may be permitted to marvel at the folly of Japan in wantonly attacking a country with whom she had no real cause for enmity, and whose friendship was indeed essential to her own welfare. As a result of this unprovoked conflict, Japan was brought to the verge of ruin, nor is it conceivable that she will regain her former status as a first-rank power during the present generation. If the United States emerged victorious from the fray, it cannot be said that she derived any substantial benefit beyond the elimination of that menace of war which had been for many years a perpetual source of anxiety to her statesmen. Her shipping trade was virtually destroyed, and as yet it shows no sign of recovery. The enormous expenditure in which she had been involved left its inevitable aftermath of high taxation and consequent social unrest. War is never a paying proposition from any national point of view, and the great conflict of which the salient phases are described in the foregoing pages has proved, in its material aspects at least, scarcely less disastrous to victors than to vanquished.
This concludes The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. If you want to download this or similar complete audiobooks, visit our webshop at www.payhip.com/Intonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.